Please be seated. Back in early February, before we began our Lenten journey, the New York Times did its sex and love issue. That's right, I just said sex and church. But let's be fair, Paul started it, okay? So there was all kinds of articles, one claiming that Gen X has the best sex. Finally, we wanted something. I didn't read it, but that's what they say. But the one that I found most interesting was an article by David Oppenheimer that was called How I Learned That the Problem in My Marriage Was Me. So he and his wife, who is also a marriage therapist, oh my gosh, decided to go to marriage therapy basically publicly, right? They went to this very famous marriage counselor called Dr. Terry Real, and they were able to do so at a lower cost by agreeing to be videotaped, and then I guess eventually writing an article about it. And Dr. Real, which don't you think is a great name for a therapist, right? Time to get real with Dr. Real. Dr. Real believes that, despite what Oppenheimer said, that he, or men in general, are not the problem with marriages or with the world. The problem is all of us, regardless of our gender, who are unable to talk about our feelings and to own up for responsibility for our own behavior. And he believes that generally in our society, we think of empowerment as focused on ourselves, right? So all the self-help things, right? He describes it as, I was lost, but now I'm found, so forget you. Forget is not the word he used, but I can talk about sex, but there's some things I can't say. But he says what we really should be doing is what he calls relational empowerment, right? He says, instead of saying I was lost, but now I'm found, or I was strong, but now I'm weak, and so it's all about me now, why not say I was weak, but now I'm strong, and I want to bring that into my relationship with you, right? I want to be honest about what I need, about all my own shortcomings, and ask what I can do to support you, because I love you. I think the story of Moses with the burning bush is a pretty well-known one. You recognized it, right, with the kid, the picture of the burning bush. He's the only one who got a burning bush, too, right? I mean, lots of people got lots of interesting experiences when they were called from God, but that was a particular one. And I think generally we think of it as God came and said, I'd like you to help me out with this. And Moses said, I have a few questions, a few complaints, a few reasons why this isn't going to work. And eventually God convinces Moses to do what God wants him to do. But it's interesting to me because that's not actually what first happened, right? The first thing that happened is there was a bush that was on fire and it wasn't being consumed. And the first thing after God tells Moses what God wants Moses to do is God tells Moses God's name. Granted, Moses asks, because you don't want to go to the people without a clear name for whatever you're asking them to do something on behalf of. But it's interesting to me because I think more than anything, what God wanted from Moses was that Moses would pay attention, right? He could have just walked right by that bush. He could have said, that's beautiful, and kept on herding the sheep, beating out the murder rap that he was there in the wilderness trying to avoid. But instead, he turned and paid attention. Because the truth is, God can do whatever God wants, right? If God wants the people to be free, then that's going to happen one way or the other. But God wanted someone to be in relationship with God. God wanted to work with the people. God wanted the people to know his name, right? Like that song from Cheers. It wasn't just about, here's what I want, now you need to do it. It was about, I love you and I want to be in relationship with you. I want your people to be free and I want you to be a part of that. Well, as you may know, it didn't go very well. Finally, Moses agrees, but then it takes a long time to convince Pharaoh, and then they're in the wilderness, and a lot of things go wrong. In today's list of the series of lists that we call the epistles, Paul tells us all the things that went wrong when they were in the wilderness, moving from enslavement to the promised land. And there were a lot of things. Now, we got to start by saying, we've talked about this, Paul. when you talk about Jewish people and you say that they didn't know something that we did know, there's a short line between that and between anti-Semitism, so just be careful. But in today's reading, it seems like he's saying that in fact, the Jewish people were baptized when they passed through the river and that they had communion when they ate from the manna from heaven. I'm not sure that's better, but at least he's trying to say there's a connection, right? That all of these things that happened to our Hebrew ancestors were not because they were worse than we were or better than we were, but because there was a lesson for us to be taken from it. Or maybe that's not why they happened, but that is what we can do. We can learn from what happened to them when they were journeying in the wilderness. So what did happen to them when they were journeying in the wilderness? Yes, I did cross-reference all of these references. Thank you for asking. So there's 3 stories that Paul talks about, right? The first one's the golden calf, idolatry. You've probably caught up on that. You might know the golden calf. Moses leaves for a beat, and then they start freaking out and decide they got to worship somebody other than the God who just delivered them from slavery. They build a cow. What we don't cover in Sunday school was the consequence. So Moses decided to get this newly formed priesthood, the Levites, that he's just made into an order of priests, and he says, go kill everybody. Kill whoever you can. That's the consequence, right? Okay. So then, later on, as they're traveling, they meet some of the lovely women who live there in the wilderness. And it turns out the men want to marry them. So I just need to say, the sexual immorality referenced in this letter is heterosexuality, okay, for the record? Yes. The problem was that the men wanted to marry women who lived in the area where they were traveling. Apparently that's a no-no. So at this time, God tells them, so say the scriptures, not just to kill all the guys who've done that, but to put a pole through them and put them out where everyone can see. I know, it was better when Paul just summed it up, wasn't it? And finally, apparently when they rejected Christ, is that how he put it? What that really meant was that they said, why aren't you making food magically appear? Which God, to be clear, did do. But they kept complaining, right? They didn't have the good food. They didn't have the water they wanted. It would have been better if they'd just been slaves in Egypt. Would it have been, though? And so God, so they say, so the story goes, sends a snake into the people. And the snake starts biting people, and all of them are killed. So that's what happened to the people after Moses helped them be delivered from slavery. It's not a great story, is it? Which makes you wonder, who's who in this parable of the fig tree, right? Because listening to those stories, you think it's got to be God who's the mad fig tree owner. I don't know, the person who planted the fig tree, right? Because if you do anything that upsets God, like if you try to worship other gods or try to leave God to be with other people or try to say that you need food more than you need God, then God's going to kill you, right? No fruit from the tree gets cut down. But then who's the other guy, right? Who's the guy who comes along and says, you know what, let's put a little soil on it, give it some time, see what we can do. Let's give it another shot. Could that also be God? Because what actually happens in all of those stories that Paul referenced is that God gives people another chance. I mean, here we are, right? So the golden calf happens, Moses gets mad, destroys all the laws that he just wrote with God or that God gave him, and then God says, fine, let's try this again. We'll get you a whole nother set of laws, right? The people stray from God, and God says, let you come back to me, and those of you who have been faithful to me, we're going to try this again, right? The serpent moves through the people, and God gives Moses a little statue of a serpent to hold up so that everybody who looks on it can be cured. Every single time, even though these horrible things happened, and let me just tell you, humans did most of those horrible things, right? Maybe all of them. Sometimes they thought it was because what God wanted them to do, but they were the ones hurting each other for the most part. And every time, God says, let's try this again, right? Which makes me wonder, could it be that the problem in our relationship with God is us, right? I know we don't like to think of things that way, but it is Lent, right? usually our time to look at our lives and examine what we're doing. If God says to us, I love you, and I want to be in relationship with you, and we say, how can I win this argument, right? How can I get from God what I want? Then there's obviously going to be some trouble. Whenever bad things happen, we try to look for an answer, right? What caused this to happen? And yes, Paul's right. We can learn lessons from the bad things that have happened to us and from other people. But God never wanted from us to be perfect. We are not fig trees. And also, I'm not an expert on trees, but I'm pretty sure trees don't usually make fruit in the first 3 years, yes? So. But we're not trees, right? Sometimes we make fruit and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we're standing and sometimes we fall. And God has promised through God's covenant that God is going to be with us no matter what. No matter what we do, no matter how we live. And the answer to that is not that we should then go do whatever we want and see how bad we can be. The answer is that what God wants most from us in that covenant is relationship. And that is what we are meant to do with our Lenten journey and with our Christian journey. How can I be in a deeper relationship with God? How can I figure out what God would have me do and how God would have me live? When she was on her deathbed, St. Julian of Norwich, they came to do last rites, and she looked on the cross, so the story goes, and she had a vision, and suddenly all of her pain went away, and she had a vision of Jesus' face. And then she had a vision of something really tiny, like a fig, perhaps, a little small circle that she was holding in her hands. And she understood from the vision that that little circle represented all of creation, everything. She was holding literally the whole world in her hands, the way that God does. And she had this understanding as she held it that God made it, that God loved it, and that God would sustain it, no matter what. Let's try this again, right? Whatever we're doing with our lives and in our journey of faith, let's try again. What God longs for most is to have us know that we are made by and cared for and sustained by God. What God longs for most is for us to know God's name and to be in relationship with God. We're going to mess up and bad things are going to happen. And we can spend a lot of time trying to figure out why that is, or we can figure out what are we supposed to do next. And what we are supposed to do next is to figure out the best way for us to live in relationship with God and to begin again.